The stone was warm in Isa's hand. It was a recording stone, a small oval of pale mineral that her people had used for 10,000 years to carry messages between cities. She pressed her thumb to its flat face and spoke into it, not because she believed anyone would come, but because her people had always believed that words spoken into the world did not simply disappear. They traveled. They found places to rest. She stood at the edge of what had been the outer wall of the Song Hall of Vellani Prime. The wall was gone now. Most of the city was gone. The sky above her was the wrong color, a deep, bruised orange that came from particulate matter thrown into the upper atmosphere by the bombardment. The Dominion fleet had not finished its work. It was simply pausing, the way a boot pauses before it finishes coming down. She spoke clearly and without rushing. We did not fight. We had nothing to fight with. Our cities were built for sound, not for war. Our greatest achievement was a hall that could carry a single voice to 10,000 ears without any device to help it. We built beautiful things. We tried to share them. If anyone is listening, we were here. We existed. We mattered to each other, even if we did not matter to you. She pressed the stone closed and put it in her coat. Around her, 11 other Vellani moved through the rubble. They were not searching for survivors. They had done that already. They were gathering recording stones, thousands of them, from homes and public squares and the collapsed archives of the hall. Each stone held something, a voice, a memory, a name. They did not speak to each other while they worked. There was nothing useful to say. Above the orange sky, Grand Marshal Voru stood on the observation deck of his flagship and watched the thermal imaging of Vellani Prime's surface. The heat signatures from the first bombardment were still fading. His tacticians had advised a second pass within the hour to ensure full compliance with the clearance order. He was not troubled by the word compliance. He had stopped being troubled by the operational language of the clearance program many years ago. It was cleaner this way to have words that described the work without describing the work. A clearance order, a compliance sweep, a resource liberation zone. Clean words for clean outcomes. He approved the second bombardment and went to eat his midday meal. In the offices of the Galactic Observation Council, Ambassador Farden had been awake for 20 hours. He was a tall being, long-necked and careful in his movements, the way his species always was when they were distressed. He had filed 17 formal objections with the Dominion High Council over the past 4 days. He had received 3 automated acknowledgments and nothing else. He filed an 18th. He did not believe it would matter, but the record needed to show that someone had objected. That was what the council was for in the end, not to stop things, to record them. He sat back in his chair and looked at the feed from the Vellani system. The second bombardment was beginning. The Song Cities, those extraordinary structures that had taken his breath away the one time he had visited Vellani Prime, were coming down in lines of fire and pressure waves. He turned the feed off. He could not watch it and also keep working, and he needed to keep working. 41 light-years from Vellani Prime, in a region of space that did not appear on any Dominion star chart, a human observation station sat dark and cold against the void. It was called Station Marin. It had been there for 9 years. It had a crew of 6. Their job was to watch and record and transmit. First Watcher Noma was the senior officer. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, but economical with his words in the way that people become when they spend long stretches in small spaces with the same few colleagues. He had been monitoring the situation in Vellani space for the past week. He had 3 screens of data running at any given moment. He slept 4 hours a night. He was reviewing a signal sweep when something caught his attention. It was a narrowband transmission, very low power, broadcasting on a frequency that had not been used for active communication in decades, an old Vellani emergency band, the kind used before their civilization had developed better long-range tools. Almost nothing could have picked it up except equipment specifically calibrated to monitor broad spectral ranges. Station Marin's equipment was calibrated for exactly that. He isolated the signal and ran the translation matrix. The message was short. He read it twice. "We did not fight. We had nothing to fight with. If anyone is listening, we were here." Nomo sat with that for a while. The station hummed around him. One of his colleagues was asleep in the next compartment. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same as always, distant, indifferent, unchanged by anything that happened near them. He pulled up the operational file for the Velani system. 3 worlds already cleared. The 4th in process. Estimated completion of the clearance order, 6 days. He read Issa's message a 3rd time. Then he opened the long-range transmitter and composed a message to Earth Command. He did not write a report. He did not write a recommendation or a formal request. He had been a first watcher for 11 years, and he understood that there were moments when the elaborate language of bureaucracy was simply not the right tool. He wrote one word. "Enough." He sent it and leaned back in his chair. Through the viewport, the stars held their positions. 41 light-years away, a second line of fire was crossing the surface of Velani Prime. The Song cities were going dark one by one. But the stone was already traveling. The data did not fit on a single wall. Lena Broft had tried early on to keep the record organized by date. That had worked for the first 3 years. Then it had grown too large for a single timeline, and she had split it into categories: species affected, systems involved, method of clearance, casualty estimates, economic outcomes for the Dominion. Now it lived across 47 linked files and a physical board in her quarters that covered every surface she was allowed to use. She was not a dramatic person. She did not pace or gesticulate when she spoke. She stood at the front of the briefing room aboard the Unspoken and walked Admiral Dara Akin through the record the same way she might walk someone through a repair manual, methodically, without editorializing, letting the information carry its own weight. The Unspoken was running dark. No emissions, no active sensors. It had been parked in the same coordinates for 6 weeks, which in terms of deep space operations was not long at all. Dara sat at the table with Captain Roll Sands and 3 senior officers. They were the only people on the ship who had seen the full briefing. Lena began. The Teresi were the first, 29 years ago. A civilization of approximately 4 billion distributed across 2 systems. The Dominion issued a clearance order citing navigational interference. Their home system sat on a trade corridor the Dominion wanted to expand. The clearance took 11 weeks. There were no survivors in the cleared zones. She moved to the next file. The Myron Collective, 18 years ago. 11 billion across 6 systems. The Dominion's stated reason was resource competition. The actual reason, based on intercepted communications, was that the Myron had begun developing gravitational sensor technology that the Dominion considered a military risk. The clearance took 4 months. Next file. The Salyun, 9 years ago. A single-system civilization. Population of approximately 2 billion. The Dominion did not bother with a stated reason for that one. The operational order simply classified their home world as a development zone. Dara had read all of this before. She had read it many times. She listened anyway, because Lena's voice carried information that the files alone could not. The flat, careful tone of someone who had spent 12 years with these numbers and had chosen not to let them break her, because breaking would not help anyone. Roll was watching the table. He was a man who processed things quietly. He had grown up reading about the Teresi in school. They were ancient history by then, a footnote in a unit about galactic civilizations. He remembered thinking, as a child, that someone should have done something. He had not yet understood that someone, somewhere, was already preparing to. Lena closed the historical files. The Velani, current. Population before the clearance order, approximately 300 million across 4 worlds. 3 worlds have been cleared. Velani Prime is under active bombardment. Estimated time to completion, 5 days. She put down her data pad. That is the record, 30 years, 4 civilizations. Combined population loss, approximately 15 billion. The Dominion has never been formally challenged on any of it. Dara spoke for the first time since the briefing began. Fleet status. Roll pulled up the tactical display. 600 warships, 40 support vessels, all positioned. The outermost ships have been in place for 4 years. The positioning took 11 years to complete without triggering Dominion sensor sweeps. Every ship is running dark. No Dominion patrol has come within range of any of our vessels in the entire deployment period. Dara nodded slowly. They never looked. They had no reason to, Lena said. Their intelligence files classify humanity as an isolated, low-development species. Their most recent survey of our systems was conducted 19 years ago. It noted agricultural development and limited spaceflight. They did not look again. Roll allowed himself a small, dry expression. That was useful. It was. It had been the single most useful thing about humanity's position, not their technology, not their planning, not even the 30 years of preparation. The most useful thing was that the Dominion had decided long ago that humans were not interesting enough to watch. They had been wrong, but the error had given humanity time to work. Dara stood and walked to the viewport. The stars outside were the same stars that Dominion ships were traveling between at this very moment, carrying clearance orders and compliance reports, and all the ordinary machinery of an empire that had never once been made to account for what it did. She said, "We send them the warning." Lena nodded. She had prepared it. "It is ready." The warning was not long. It identified the human fleet by position and number. It summarized the record in 4 paragraphs, not the full 12 years, but enough. It stated the demand clearly: withdraw from Velani space within 72 hours. Stand down all active clearance orders across all systems. Acknowledge receipt and intent to comply. It also stated, simply and without embellishment, what would happen if they did not. Roll transmitted it personally. He used the Dominion's own high-frequency command band, the one reserved for communications between fleet admirals and the High Council. Using it without authorization was technically an act of aggression under Dominion law. He did not lose sleep over that. Grand Marshal Voru received the warning 6 hours later. He read it standing up, which was unusual for him. He read it twice. Then he handed it to his communications officer and said, "Find out what humanity is." The communications officer returned 20 minutes later with the intelligence file. It was not large, agricultural, limited spaceflight, last surveyed 19 years ago. Voru read it, then he looked at the warning again. Then he sent back a one-word reply. Noted. And he returned to the observation deck to watch the compliance sweep on Velani Prime continue. In the dark, 600 human ships received no word from Earth Command telling them to stand down. They received instead a single short message from the unspoken. Admiral Dara Akin had written it herself. It said, "All ships prepare to move." In 11 years of silent positioning, not one of those ships had powered its drive. Now, one by one in the cold and the dark, they began to wake up. The first sign was silence. Not the silence of empty space that was normal, expected, the background condition of any fleet operation. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes when something that should be making noise stops making noise all at once. Grand Marshal Voru's long-range sensors went dark at 3:40 fleet time. All of them. Simultaneously. Not a cascade failure, not a power surge, just gone, cleanly, as if someone had reached into the system and removed the function without disturbing anything around it. His sensor officer reported the anomaly in a voice that was professionally steady but carried, at its edges, a note of something the officer had probably never felt before on duty. Voru walked to the forward viewport. 200 kilometers off the bow of his flagship, a ship appeared. It did not decloak in the dramatic fashion of some species, no shimmer, no visual disturbance, no energy bloom. It was simply not there, and then it was. A long, dark vessel with a hull that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. No visible weapons, no active emissions, just presence. Voru stared at it. His tactical officer said very quietly, "Marshal, there are more." There were 600 more. They came into view over the course of 40 seconds, not all at once, which would have been theatrical, but in a steady, unhurried sequence that was somehow worse. Each ship took its place in a formation that Voru's tactical AI spent 3 full minutes trying to classify before returning the assessment. No known equivalent. The formation was three-dimensional, roughly spherical, and had positioned the Dominion fleet at its exact center. Voru had 400 ships. He had never felt, until this moment, that 400 was a small number. He gave the order to fire. The Dominion fleet opened up with everything it had. Plasma batteries, rail-accelerated impactors, disruptor beams, the full suite of weapons that had cleared 4 civilizations and enforced the will of the Empire across 300 years of expansion. The fire hit the human ships and did what fire always does when it meets something it was not designed to stop. It spread across the hull surfaces, was absorbed, redistributed, and dissipated. Not deflected, absorbed. As though the human ships were drinking it. The human fleet did not return fire. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of the Dominion fleet expending ammunition and energy against targets that sat still and took it, and then Voru's tactical officer said, "Marshal, their weapons are moving." The human ships had not fired a single weapon in those 11 minutes. What they had done was deploy, from concealed bays along their lower hulls, a network of small autonomous units, each one no larger than a personal vehicle. They moved through the Dominion formation without triggering point defense systems because they were too small and too slow to register as threats. They attached to drive units, to weapons arrays, to communications antennae. And then, in a second coordinated pulse, they burned out exactly those systems and nothing else. Not the life support, not the bridge, not the crew quarters, just the things that made the ships dangerous and mobile. In 12 minutes, 200 Dominion warships lost drive capability. In 15 minutes, their weapons went cold. They were not destroyed. They were made quiet. Voru pulled his remaining fleet back toward the edge of the system and transmitted a priority signal to the Dominion core. On the surface of Villani Prime, the bombardment had stopped. Private Bess Oren had been on search and rescue operations for 31 hours without sleep when her scanner returned a cluster of life signs from beneath a section of collapsed archive structure. She called her team over. They were careful the rubble was unstable, and the particulate in the air was making everyone's filters work hard. They found 11 Villani in a sealed lower chamber. They were sitting in a circle with their hands flat on the floor, which Oren would later learn was a Villani practice of communal steadying, a way of feeling that the ground was still there when nothing else was certain. One of the Villani looked up at Oren. She was older than the others, with gray-streaked fur and calm, very dark eyes. She looked at Oren's suit, her helmet, the human shape of her, and she said something in Villani that the translation unit rendered as, "You are not Dominion." Oren pulled off her helmet, which was against protocol in an atmosphere with unknown particulate levels, but some moments required a face. "No, we are human. We are here to take you somewhere safe." The older Villani, Isa, Oren would learn her name later, looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Why did you come?" Oren thought about the correct official answer. Then she set it aside. "Because you were here and we heard you." Isa looked at her for another long moment. Then she reached into her coat and closed her hand around something small. She nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when a thing they did not entirely believe turns out to be true. Back in Dominion space, High Speaker Olin Tran had received Voru's emergency signal and convened the High Council. The message was fragmented. Human interference with communications was already affecting transmissions across a wide range, but the content was clear enough. An unknown fleet, 600 vessels, weapons technology beyond current Dominion countermeasures, 200 warships disabled without loss of life. Tran asked his military advisors for options. They gave him one: send more ships, overwhelmed by numbers. He approved it: 1,200 additional warships, drawn from 3 regional commands, ordered to Velani space at maximum drive. They would outnumber the humans 2-1. What neither Tran nor his advisors understood, as they moved their pieces across the board, was that this was not a surprise attack that had caught humanity off guard and forced a response. This was step 3 of a 30-year plan. And humanity had written every step. Issa had never seen a star map that large. The display filled the entire forward wall of the room they had given her, on the unspoken, a room that smelled faintly of something she could not identify, something warm and slightly sharp, which she would later learn humans called coffee. The map showed the galaxy in its broad shape, with the Dominion's territory marked in pale red. It covered a wide portion of the inner arm. She had known, abstractly, that the Dominion was large. Seeing it rendered at scale was a different thing entirely. Captain Roll Sand stood beside her and let her look for a while before he said anything. He had learned in the past 6 hours of having Velani survivors aboard that they processed information slowly and thoroughly and did not benefit from being rushed. He waited. Esau said, "How many ships did the Dominion send?" 1,200, coming to join the 400 already in your system. 1,600 total when they arrive. And you have 600. Here, yes. She looked at him carefully. Her dark eyes moved across his face in the way of someone reading text rather than looking at a person. You said here. Roll touched the display. At 8 points across the Dominion's territory, spread across a region 400 light-years wide, small indicators pulsed blue. Each one represented a human fleet element that had been in position for between 3 and 7 years. Not the 600 ships here. Different ships, dedicated to different targets. Issa looked at the 8 points. She was quiet for a long time. You did not come only for us, she said. No, Roll said. You were the line, the moment we were waiting for, but the operation was never only about Velani space. She looked at the map again. The 8 blue points sat over 2 major Dominion shipyards, a logistics hub that supplied 40% of the outer fleet, 3 communications relay stations that the entire Dominion command network depended on, 1 military academy that trained the majority of Dominion fleet officers, and the central supply depot for the clearance program itself. When the Dominion sent everything to our system, Esau said slowly, they left these places with less protection. They left them with standard garrison forces, which is what those locations always have, because no one has ever threatened them, because no one has been able to. Esau said nothing. She put her hand against the display, gently, the way her people touched things they were trying to understand. Roll said, it has already started. Had. At 600 fleet time, simultaneous to the Dominion reinforcement fleet's departure toward Velani space, the 8 human fleet elements at their preposition coordinates had moved. Not with the dramatic full-power charge of a military strike, they had powered up their drives at minimum output and simply arrived, appearing at their target locations the same way the Unspoken's fleet had appeared at Velani Prime. Dark ships from nowhere. The Dominion garrisons at each location had opened fire. The results were the same as they had been at Velani Prime, absorbed, returned as silence, and then the quiet work of making everything non-functional without making anyone dead. The 2 shipyards went dark within 4 hours. No explosions, no debris fields. The construction equipment stopped working. The power grids locked. The workers were unharmed and deeply confused. The logistics hub took longer 6 hours because its garrison was larger and more persistent. But persistence, against human hull composites, produced the same outcome as brief resistance. Eventually, the shooting stopped because shooting was not working, and when it stopped, the humans sent a shuttle with a medical team to treat the wounded, which had not been what the garrison expected to happen next. Grand Marshal Voru received fragmented reports of all this, as his reinforcement fleet was still in transit. The communications disruption was significant. Dominion relay systems across a wide region were degraded, which made coordination difficult and information unreliable. What he could piece together suggested that something was happening at multiple points in Dominion territory simultaneously. He could not get a full picture. The human interference was too pervasive. What he could confirm was that the 1,200 ships he had sent were arriving at Velani space and forming up for a direct engagement. He prepared to lead the charge himself. Dara watched the Dominion formation on the tactical display from the Bridge of the Unspoken. 1,600 ships. It was, she had to acknowledge, a genuinely impressive number. The Dominion had built its empire on the back of that kind of mass, the ability to bring overwhelming force to any point and sustain it. The problem was that mass, once committed to a point, was not elsewhere. She had a conversation, around this time, with Issa. The Velani elder had asked to see the bridge. Dara had allowed it. Issa stood near the viewport and watched the distant signatures of the Dominion fleet assembling. "Your people do not fight the same way," Issa said. "No. You do not fight in lines. Lines work when your strength is in concentration. Our strength is in distribution. Every captain in our fleet can make independent decisions within the larger plan. No orders need to reach them in real time. They know what the goal is. They find their own path to it." Issa considered this. "That is how water moves," she said. Dara looked at her. "Water does not move in lines," Issa continued. "It finds every available path simultaneously. It does not fight the shape of the land. It works with it, around it, through it." She paused. "Our builders used that principle to carry sound through our cities." Dara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a better description of it than any I have heard from my own people." Outside, the Dominion fleet began its charge. Inside the Unspoken, 600 human ships moved to meet it, not in a line, not in a wall, but in a flowing, adaptive shape that had no name in any Dominion tactical manual. The Dominion fleet fired everything it had. "Roll watch the display," he said. "Day 9 begins." Voru's flagship had not moved in 4 days. It was not damaged. All life support was functioning. The crew was fed and housed and unharmed. But its drives were cold, its weapons were inactive, and the communications array had been stripped of every long-range function by the small autonomous units that had attached themselves to the hull on day 11 and done their quiet work while Voru's engineers tried to stop them. He had tried to stop them for 6 hours. Then he had stopped trying because the units were not responding to any interference, and his engineers were exhausting themselves for no result. He had told them to rest. He had sat in his command chair and listened to his own ship breathe around him. Now it was day 22, and a human shuttle had docked with his ship. Voru had served the Dominion for 38 years. He had commanded fleets. He had issued clearance orders. He had written compliance reports. He had attended ceremonies in which the Empire celebrated its own expansion. He was not a man given to doubt. He had built his entire self on the absence of doubt. He was experiencing doubt now. The human who came aboard did not bring guards. She came with one other person, a young officer who carried a data pad and stood slightly behind her. The Admiral herself was not physically imposing. She was of average height, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that comes not from the absence of feeling but from very long practice at containing it. She sat across from Voru at the table in the ship's main briefing room. She did not speak immediately. She placed a data pad on the table between them. She said, "I would like you to read this." He looked at the pad without touching it. "What is it?" "A record, 30 years of observation, 4 civilizations, everything the Dominion did and everything we watched happen." She paused. "And everything we watched ourselves do nothing about for longer than we should have." He picked up the pad. She left the room. The young officer Roll-San sat by the door and did not speak, and Voru read. He read for 3 hours and 20 minutes. Dara waited in the corridor outside, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, which was not dignified and which she did not care about. She drank water. She thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had developed over 30 years of waiting. When Voru emerged, his expression was different. It was not broken. He was not a man whose face broke easily, but something in the architecture of his certainty had shifted, and it showed in the small things, the way he held his shoulders, the pace of his walk. He sat back down. He looked at her across the table. He said, "How long were you watching?" 30 years. "And you waited this long?" "We were hoping you would stop on your own," she said. It was a simple statement, not an accusation. Every time the council issued a clearance order, our command reviewed it. Every time there was a vote. For many years the vote was to wait. Because you were not ready. Because we were not certain that force was the right answer. We have spent a great deal of our history using force as a first answer. We have learned not completely, but somewhat, that it is rarely the best one. Voru was quiet. Then, the Teresi. "I was a junior officer when that clearance was issued. I filed the operational reports." Dara did not respond to that. She let him sit with it. After a while he said, "What are your terms?" She told him. The Dominion was not to be dismantled. Its people were not to be punished for the decisions of its leadership. The occupied territories were to be released over a structured period of time, with human observers present to ensure the process was completed. The clearance program was to be formally dissolved and its operational orders declared void. The Dominion military was to be reduced to a defense force only enough to protect its own systems, not enough to threaten anyone else's. A Reconstruction Council would oversee the transition for 20 years. Voru listened to all of this. He said, "You could simply have destroyed us. Your fleet capability suggests you had that option." "Yes. Why didn't you?" Dara said, "Because 15 billion people are already gone. The answer to that is not to add more. The answer to that is to make certain it does not happen again." At the Dominion Corps, High Speaker Olin Tran had not slept in 9 days. His council chamber had become a permanent crisis room. Reports came in from across the Empire shipyard silent, relay stations offline, supply lines broken, the outer fleet immobilized. The Dominion was not destroyed. It was suspended, held in place like a hand caught in the moment before it strikes, unable to move forward or back. His military advisors gave him their assessment. Continued resistance was not possible with current operational capacity. They had no functioning shipyards to repair or replace losses. They had no supply lines to sustain extended engagement. They had no communications network reliable enough to coordinate any meaningful counteraction. What they had was a civilization of 40 billion people who still needed to eat and breathe and live. Tran thought about that for a long time. He thought about the Teresi, which he had always considered a strategic success. He thought about the Velani, which he had considered an operational necessity. He thought about the recording stone that, he had been told, a Velani elder intended to give him personally. He did not know what was on it. He was afraid to find out. He decided to find out anyway. He accepted the terms. The signing ceremony took place on a neutral station 12 days later. Isa stood beside Dara at the table where the accord was placed. She did not speak during the ceremony. She held a small stone in her hand. When the signing was complete, She walked to where Olin Tran stood, and she held it out to him. He took it uncertain. Dara said quietly, she recorded a final message from the surface of her world when she believed no one was coming. She was broadcasting on an old emergency frequency that almost nothing could have picked up. A pause. We picked it up. Tran held the stone. He did not press it to activate the recording. He just held it. The accord was filed. The war was over. On the galactic communication networks, the news moved outward at the speed of signal, and every species that had lived in the shadow of the Dominion's power for centuries began asking the same question. Who are the humans? The queue of formal contact requests had reached 61 species by the time Ambassador Far Din made his way to the front of it. He had a certain advantage. He was already on the neutral station where the accord had been signed, and he had a pre-existing relationship with humanity, in the sense that he had filed 18 formal objections to Dominion behavior, and humanity had been, apparently, the only entity paying close attention to what happened to those objections. They had not met before, but there was a shared history of watching the same events from different directions, and that counted for something. He found Dara in a small common room off the main corridor, sitting at a table with a cup of something hot and a data pad she was not reading. She looked like a person who had been operating at high intensity for a long time and had just been given permission to stop, and was not entirely sure how to do that. He sat across from her. He asked if he could ask her the question everyone was asking. She said yes. Your species, he said, was classified by the Dominion as a low-development, isolated civilization. Their last survey of your systems found agricultural communities and early spaceflight. That was 19 years ago. He folded his hands on the table. 600 warships, hull technology that absorbs directed energy, a drive system that leaves no detectable signature, autonomous disabling units that bypass any known point defense system. A 30-year surveillance network covering the entire Dominion's operational range. He stopped. None of that is consistent with what the Dominion's file said you were. Dara looked at her cup. No, she agreed. How? She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just organizing. Then she said, when the Dominion surveyed us 19 years ago, everything they recorded was accurate. We had agricultural communities. We had early spaceflight. We also had a decision made about 10 years before that survey that we were going to be something different. What kind of decision? A civilizational one. Not from a single government, we have many. But there was enough agreement, across enough of our leadership, that what we were watching in this galaxy was going to reach us eventually if we did nothing. And we had a specific theory. Far waited. The Dominion was very good at responding to known threats, Dara said. It had built its entire military and intelligence apparatus around identifying and responding to things it already knew about. It had categories, fleet sizes, technology classes. It put everything it encountered into a category and responded according to the category. She paused. We did not fit any of its categories, so it did not watch us, and we decided to take full advantage of that. Far thought about this. You deliberately appeared smaller than you were. We appeared exactly as small as we genuinely were at first. Then we built. But we built in systems the Dominion had not mapped, using resources from regions their charts did not cover, and we built quietly. No large energy signatures. No test fire events they could detect. Every piece of technology was developed and tested in conditions that would not register on any sensor pointed in our direction. Far said, for 30 years. For 30 years. He sat with that. He had spent his career in diplomacy, in the machinery of communication between species, and he understood something about what 30 years of sustained, coordinated, secret effort required. Not just the technology, not just the resources, the agreement, the shared patience, the ability of a civilization composed of many nations and many disagreements to hold a single long-term commitment across 3 decades without breaking it. "Were you afraid," he asked, "that it would not work?" Dara's expression shifted, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. "Every day," she said, "for 30 years, one detected ship, one intercepted transmission, one survey mission that went a degree further than the last one. Any of those things and the entire preparation becomes worthless because you have lost the one advantage that makes it possible." She set down her cup. "Patience is not comfortable. It is just necessary." Far asked if he could meet Issa. He could. Issa was in a medical bay, not injured, but under observation because Velani physiology had not previously encountered several compounds common in human food preparation, and the medical team was being careful. She was sitting up. She had agreed, through a Velani translator, to speak with the ambassador. She looked at Far when he came in. He was the first non-human she had spoken to since the rescue. She regarded him with the same careful, thorough attention she gave everything. He told her that he had filed 18 objections on behalf of her people. She said, "I know, we heard about the objections." A pause. "We thought they were kind, we did not think they would help." Far said, "I am sorry they did not help sooner." Issa looked at him for a moment. Then she said something that the translator took a few seconds to process. "You were a witness. That is not nothing. We needed witnesses. We needed the record to exist." She glanced toward the corridor in the general direction of wherever Dara was. "And we needed someone to act. Both things were necessary. You did one. They did the other." Far thought about that for a long time on the journey back to the council station. Dara finished her report to Earth Command on the 7th day after the accord. It was long operational details, fleet status, the terms of the Reconstruction Council, casualty figures, which in the human fleet were 0, and in the Dominion fleet were low enough that the medical teams had managed every case. She wrote all of it efficiently and without difficulty. She stopped at the section where the record required her to state the reason for the operation. The formal reason, the one that would be filed and archived and cited in whatever came next. She wrote several versions. She wrote about galactic stability, about the protection of pre-military civilizations, about the Dominion's pattern of behavior and the projected continuation of that pattern. All of it was true. None of it felt like the right thing to put in the box. She deleted all of it. She wrote because they were there, and we could not say we did not hear them. She filed the report. The unspoken began its journey home. Across the galaxy, in 61 different waiting rooms, 61 different species were preparing their formal introductions to humanity. Some were afraid. Some were curious. Most were something in between. And somewhere in the dark between stars, a small recording stone was sitting in the hands of a man who had signed away an empire, carrying the voice of a woman who had not believed anyone was listening. She had been wrong about that. She had never been so glad to be wrong.